Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. So I'm Dom Gilchrist. I head up the behaviour, exclusion, and school food team at DFE, and the work on preventing violence in schools sits within my division. It's great to see such a large number of people on the webinar today, and I can see that people are still joining. Obviously, the number of people is sort of very satisfying to us, but it's also, we've seen from the registration, the range of stakeholders that we have today, that we obviously have school leaders and school stakeholders, school safe guarding leads, but we've got wider school stakeholders and non-school stakeholders. And given that we know that this challenge is going to be solved in a multi-agency way, it's really brilliant to see that represented in the attendees of the webinar today. So today's webinar is the second in a series of four. Some of you may have joined the first one, Leading Violence Prevention and Education, Putting What Works into Action. And today's focus is on attendance, suspensions, exclusions, and trusted adults. You all know, and I know from elsewhere in my portfolio, that disengagement from education, particularly from repeated exclusions, increases vulnerability to exploitation and serious violence. And research from our colleagues at the Youth Endowment Fund showed that children who are suspended or excluded are nearly 2.5 times more likely to be involved in violence. So this topic really matters. This series is designed to help you adopt practices proven to reduce involvement in violence and to introduce you to practical tools like the YEF's EPIC self-assessment, which supports reflection and improvement within your institution. So please do engage actively today. Please do ask questions via the Q&A at the end, and then we'll have two actions for you to take away on completing the EPIC self-assessment and then the feedback form that we will share. I'm going to hand over to YEF colleagues. I'm really pleased that today's session is going to be co-hosted by Joe Collin, who is the head of guidance and reporting, and Ben Lorraine, who is the senior change manager. So Joe, I'm handing over to you first.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. We're delighted to be presenting at the second webinar of the series of four today, as Dom explained. My name's Joe Collin. I'm the head of guidance and reporting here at the YEF. Prior to that, I worked at the EEF, which is a What Works Centre I'm sure colleagues on the call are very familiar with. And prior to that, I was a secondary history teacher. I taught at a school in Birmingham. I'm delighted to be joined by our fantastic senior change manager, Ben Lorraine, and Ben will introduce himself towards the end of the session as we get into our EPIC self-assessment tool. Before we get into the content of the session today, we're very aware that while some of you may have joined that first session, not all of you will have, and it's just important to just give a bit of a bit more context as to who we are at YEF. And the sort of comparison with the EEF is very useful for colleagues here to sort of understand who we are and what we do. So we're the government-funded What Works Centre for reducing children's involvement in violence. And in 2019, we received a £200 million endowment from the Home Office. What we aim to do, so whereas the EEF are a What Works Centre that aim to improve attainment, we're a What Works Centre who aim to prevent children's involvement in violence. So our vision, what we're aiming for, is a world where no child becomes involved in that violence. And the way in which we look to do that, our mission, is to find what works and build a movement to put that into practice. So all of our work is focused on evidence, finding the best available international evidence and putting that into practice. We do that across 7 different sectors. And across all of those sectors, one of which is education, we fund research, and that's what the majority of our endowment goes on. We also synthesize evidence. So for colleagues who are familiar with the EEF's toolkit, we have our own toolkit, the YEF toolkit. If you just Google YEF toolkit, you will see that, where we synthesize the best available international evidence on violence reduction. But we also produce guidance and guidance reports, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Before I get on to that guidance report, it's really important to just underline at the start of this session why we're covering this session, and to some extent why we exist at the YF. And that's because of the real sort of pervasive influence that violence has on children's lives. Every year we survey 11,000 13 to 17-year-olds across England and Wales. It's the biggest survey of its kind, and we published the last one in November. I've worked in this field for quite some time now, and I'm still shocked when we get these stats through. In the past year, nearly 1 in 5 13 to 17-year-olds, so teenage children, have been a victim of violence. 1 in 8, 13%, admit to perpetrating violence themselves. And 50% of children tell us that they witnessed violence being committed against someone else. It therefore shouldn't surprise us that, given violence is impacting so many children, it's inevitably going to be impacting education. It's going to be impacting education settings, schools, colleges, AP settings. It's going to be impacting teachers, and of course, it's going to be impacting children. So in the same survey that we did the previous year, when we surveyed 10,000 13 to 17-year-olds, 10% of them said they'd skipped school because they were worried about violence. And that rises to over a quarter of children who've been a victim of violence. Now, quite rightly, absence and attendance have really been at the top of the agenda and have been so salient, particularly since COVID, because we know of all of the negative impacts that absence can have. Clearly, violence is having an impact on that, and as a result, should be really alarming to us. What that report and that survey also told us was that nearly a quarter of teenage children in England report that the fear of violence has taken a toll on their mental health, disrupts their sleep, suppresses their appetite, and even makes it harder to focus in school. So, look, violence is terrible in and of itself, of course it is, but it's also impacting education and therefore impacting attendance, attainment, social emotional skill development, all the fantastic things that should be happening at school. We also survey lots of teachers, so we're delighted to have an ongoing partnership with Teacher Tap, who we've been partnered with for the last 3 years now, and we've used that partnership to ask a range of really useful questions to get teachers' insights on their experiences of violence and really critically what they think should be done about it. Just over a year ago, we asked teachers, in the past term, has a child committed any of these incidents in your school? So this was primary and secondary teachers across England. 70% of teachers reported that a physical assault had happened in their school in the previous term. 42% of the physical assault had a child had committed a physical assault against a teacher or staff member. 10% said that a child had committed a sexual assault against another child. And 13% said that a child had brought a weapon into school. Now, like, these are really shocking statistics, and again speak to that point on and violence is happening, and we need to be able to address it and talk about it. Again, it's unsurprising, therefore, that some of that is reflected in the reasons that schools are giving for why children are permanently excluded. So these are most up-to-date stats from the autumn term of last year, 24-25. So that's autumn 2024. I haven't included all of the reasons here that are given for permanent exclusion. And also quite an important caveat here is that since 2020-2021 academic year, schools can record up to 3 reasons for suspension and permanent exclusion. But the reason why I'm including them, they just give a sense of how violence is also showing up in this. So continually, what continues to be the most cited reason for permanent exclusion is persistent disruptive behaviour. But we can also see there physical assault against the pupil, physical assault against an adult, use or threat of use of an offensive weapon, and verbal abuse or threatening behaviour towards a pupil or adult. So again, we can see here how these behaviours and the instances of violence are impacting on the school community. The final sort of challenging statistic I'll share before I'll get into some more promising and hopeful remarks, I promise, are that at the moment, teachers often lack the confidence to know what to do about this. I'm really careful here to say that we're not blaming teachers or schools or senior leaders for that at all. As I mentioned at the start, I was a history teacher. This was by no means at the top of my list of things to solve. And first and foremost, schools are there to educate children and to do a whole host of different things. Neither are teachers, often given training on how to do this. And these are really difficult issues to grapple with that every sector struggles to deal with and grapple with. So I want to, and us at YF want to be really clear throughout, is that in any of these stats we're sharing, we're certainly not being critical of teachers or schools. But what we do know is that 70% of teachers report that they're not confident or not at all confident identifying or delivering evidence-based interventions for preventing children's involvement in violence. And as I said, a lot of teachers aren't trained on how to do so. So 82% of teachers and 72% of designated safeguarding leads report they've received no training on serious violence in the last 2 years. One of the fantastic things that we see from working with the education sector, the education sector love evidence. They want to talk about evidence, and they have a real passion for using it. And what we really want to do is share the evidence base that we now have for violence reduction so that teachers are more confident, DSL is more confident, and we can start to do something about some of those stats that I shared at the outset. But moving on to brighter news and some more positive reflections, there's also a really hopeful story here, and that is that education settings already are playing a really integral, crucial role in protecting children from involvement in violence. And two things can be true at once, and two things are true at the same time. And by that, I mean that yes, violence happens, it impacts children's lives, but schools are overwhelmingly, schools, colleges, AP settings are overwhelmingly safe, trusted spaces for children. So 82% of those teenagers that we surveyed, the 10,000 teenagers that we surveyed, said they felt safe at school. That's compared to only 5% who feel unsafe. Now, you know, that 5% is too high, of course it is, but the vast majority of children feel safe at school, and we should celebrate that. Schools also offer a really wide range of evidence-based support that reduce children's involvement in violence. We'll come on to talk about what those strategies are throughout this webinar and the next two. But whether that's mentoring, sports interventions, social emotional skills development, some of the fantastic content that's now in the RSHE curriculum, all of these interventions are evidence-based and protect children from involvement in violence. And of course, finally, schools play such a critical safeguarding role. They're the one universal service that every child should be. And so they play this pivotal role in identifying problems early, intervening where they need to provide support, and signposting to specialist support where it's required. So we're really keen to, you know, insert that note of positivity at the outset that the education sector really is uniquely placed to support us in reducing children's involvement in violence. The final thing I'll note before I get on to the guidance report and our evidence-based recommendations is how this has increased in salience even further in the last few months, and that's with the publication of the new education inspection framework from Ofsted. We're really delighted that in this inspection framework, there's now an expectation that every school and FE provider in England will be inspected on whether they protect children from involvement in violence, and really critically, whether they use an evidence-based approach to do so. And we very much expect that the guidance report that I think has been shared in the chat and that I'll be talking through today, that guidance report and these webinars can really support you in thinking through how can you evidence that, and really importantly, how can you embed evidence-based practice across your setting. Okay then, so in our education sector, and the work that YF had done in the education sector, we've published two guidance reports over the past 2 years. One is our education practice guidance, and the second our education systems guidance. Education practice guidance is what we're really focusing on for these 4 webinars, and that sets out 5 recommendations for head teachers of school, college and AP settings on how they can prevent children's involvement in violence. It draws on the best available international evidence, a survey of 10,000 teachers, a survey of 10,000 teenage children, and we've worked really closely with sector leaders, current head teachers, current teachers to draft that guidance and recommendations. Also, just for context, because it's important to share, and if you're interested, I'd recommend Googling Education Policy Children and Violence YF for our systems guidance. So whereas our practice guidance is focused on head teachers, and that's 5 recommendations for those head teachers, our systems guidance is 8 recommendations for policymakers and what they should do to better support schools. Moving on then, and this is where it gets exciting, where we can start to share our recommendations for what schools, colleges and AP settings should be doing to protect children from involvement in violence. And our education practice guidance, as I say, based on the best available international evidence, sets out 5 recommendations. Number 1 is to keep children and young people in education. Number 2, to provide trusted adults. Number 3 is to develop social and emotional skills. Number 4, target efforts at the places and times where violence occurs. And number 5 is to cautiously consider unproven strategies and avoid harmful approaches. Now, when we first wrote this, I remember about a week later sitting down with a head teacher of an AP setting who said, Well, yes, obviously, Joe, we're doing all of that. That's all really obvious. Yeah, you're really not reinventing the wheel here. I was delighted to hear that. A good evidence-based recommendation is feasible, it's plausible, it's deliverable. And what you'll see as we go through these recommendations is there's already lots of fantastic practice happening in schools. And we're really not expecting schools to do lots of additional work. Really not expecting schools to reinvent the wheel and deliver lots of new interventions that you'll be really unfamiliar with. Actually, what a lot of this is about is doing what you're already doing well, implementing it in line with the evidence, and being really clear that you're using particular interventions that you're very familiar with. You're using them for violence prevention purposes, and we'll come on to that to come on and talk about those in detail. The first two recommendations are what we're going to be focusing on in today's session. And those are about keeping children and young people in education and providing trusted adults. So first up is keeping children in education. The reason why this is in our guidance, Don mentioned this at the outset, the real importance of making sure that children are in school. We know that being in education protects children from involvement in violence. So we recommend 3 actions. As I've said, the guidance online, it's in the chat. And also, if you ever want to share with colleagues, if you just Google education, children and violence, the guidance is freely accessible and you can look at all of the detail in these recommended actions. But the 3 recommended actions is deliver evidence-informed attendance improvement strategies, implement whole school and targeted behaviour support to reduce the need for suspension and permanent exclusion, and provide appropriate support for temporarily suspended and permanently excluded children. So I'm just going to get into a bit more detail about those recommended actions now. First up, we've got attendance and reducing absence. Children who are absent more than 20% of the time are 2 times more likely to commit violence and 3.5 times more likely to offend. And that analysis is a piece of regression analysis that we published last year that accounts for a variety of different factors, including a child's previous behaviour. Now, without that regression analysis, I mean, it stands to reason, right? Like if children are not in school, they're not benefiting from all of the fantastic protective factors that I mentioned at the outset. They're not benefiting from the trusted adult relationships they have with teachers, with other members of staff in school, which we know are really important. They're not benefiting from the safeguarding function that schools play in protecting children and spotting early warning signs and then delivering specialist support. They're not benefiting from all of the fantastic interventions and evidence-based practice on mentoring and sports and social emotional skills development if they're not in school. So really clear. And actually, this is always a really heartening first recommendation to have with schools. Say, look, just get children in education. To which head teachers like, yes, we're doing that already. Great, fantastic. Continue to focus on that and really prioritize that. Now, the evidence based on how to do that is limited. The EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation, published a rapid evidence assessment in March of 2022, which featured 72 studies. 69 of those studies, all but 3 of them, were from the US. And even across the 72 studies, including those from the United States, were quite limited. They weren't the most robust of studies. But there are some emerging lessons that we can take from the evidence and some evidence-informed actions that we suggest in the guidance. And we're very much aligned with the EEF and then subsequently with all of the guidance that DfE have put out on this. The first is to meet with absent children and their parents and carers to really explain the reasons and really grapple with, right, why might there be absence and low attendance, and how do we get children back into school? The second is to inform parents and carers about low attendance. Talk to parents about what their preferred method of communication is, and then encourage better attendance. These tend to be really cost-effective methods. So using things like texting interventions, they make really small improvements, and they are only small improvements, but it's so cheap and cost-effective that they can be a no-brainer. And the third is to provide free breakfast clubs. We know from the really robust evaluation that happened on the Magic Breakfast programme conducted by the EEF, that in addition to a wide range of outcomes, including behaviour and attainment, providing breakfast clubs gets children into school, which is fantastic. The critical thing to know when we're thinking about using these strategies for violence reduction is to really focus on those children that you're worried most about. So really ensure that vulnerable children are being given additional support to get them back into school. So think about those children with severe levels of absence. about children who may be looked after, about children who've previously been suspended or those in alternative provision, or those children who've had previous contact with the police. Think about who those children are and make sure you're providing these strategies to them. As I said at the outset, so much fantastic practice is already happening, and in attendance, we've really seen this in the last few years. This is another stat that we've got from our partnership with Teacher Tap. It's probably slightly outdated now because I think, again, the continued focus on attendance has really improved this even further. But, 3/4 of schools, of teachers report that they're already meeting with the parents and carers of absent children. 7 in 10 say they're sending text messages to parents and carers to encourage an improvement in attendance. 39% are holding breakfast clubs. I'm sure that will be higher now as well. I'd really encourage you all to have a look at the statutory guidance on improving attendance. There's also some really useful resources that accompany that statutory guidance. There's a fantastic toolkit on communications and how you can use text messages and letters to really make the most of those to get children back into school. The second half of this recommendation around getting and keeping children in school is about suspension and permanent exclusion. Just a brief point on language here. Over the course of the last sort of 10 to 20 years, the language around this has changed a bit. So when I'm talking about suspension, I'm talking about where a child has been excluded for a fixed period of time but returns to the same school. And when I'm talking about permanent exclusion, I'm talking about where a child has been permanently excluded and doesn't return to that school. And that's the language that is very much reflected in the statutory guidance. The evidence here is clear and refers to that regression analysis that I mentioned that we published last year that shows that, and this is really critical, even once you account for a range of contextual factors, including the child's previous behaviour, so even once you take that into consideration, children who are suspended or permanently excluded from school are 2.5 times more likely to commit violence and 4.5 times more likely to commit any offence. And again, there is, we can really see the reasons for that. I won't repeat them all again, but not being in school means a child is at greater risk. Having said that, we've always been really clear at YF, and we're always really careful in our language and our messaging around this, because there's such a heat in the debate around suspension and exclusion. We've always been very clear that, of course, school leaders must retain that power and that responsibility, and there are instances where it's the appropriate action to take, of course, to suspend and permanently exclude a child. Deciding whether to suspend or permanently exclude a child is a really, really difficult decision for a head teacher to make, where they need to weigh up the needs of, yes, an individual child and what it means for them and their families, but also what it means for the wider school community. Having said that, for us, there's always been far too much focus on the debate and around that decision point of does a suspension or exclusion happen. Instead, there needs to be much more focus on what comes before and also what comes after. So in terms of what comes before, what can we do to make sure that we're doing everything we can to reduce the need for suspension and exclusion in the first place? And what that looks like is good behaviour, right? How can we put universal policies, universal behaviour strategies in schools in place? How can we make use of, effectively targeted behavioural interventions, whether that's, things like report cards, one-to-one social and emotional learning interventions, small group social and emotional learning development, making sure that we're assessing children who we think might have SEND needs and providing the appropriate support to them. Are we doing those things to make sure that behaviour in our setting is as good as it can be, and that will reduce the need for suspension and exclusion? It will reduce us ever getting to that point. Of course, suspensions and exclusions there'll always be a small amount of cases where that does happen. I'd really wholeheartedly recommend the EEF's behaviour guidance. That they've got a fantastic behaviour guidance report, which goes into a lot of detail on what the evidence base says around how to deliver universal behaviour interventions, how to deliver targeted behavioural interventions, and we've drawn a lot of our thinking in our guidance report from that. And I know that this is a real focus of the DfE, and particularly in policies like the behaviour hubs, which we're really supportive of as well. The second element to this is, yes, let's think about what comes before, but really critically, what comes after. What happens after a child is suspended? So we know that if a child is suspended or permanently excluded, they are immediately at heightened risk for all of those things that I've mentioned. They lose the structure, they lose that the trusted relationships they have with adults in school. They lose the safeguarding function often of that school. They shouldn't. We'll come on to that. So what should be done? Now, fantastically, the statutory suspension and permanent exclusion guidance makes this quite clear. There are lots of things that should be happening when a child is suspended or excluded from school. So, for instance, when a child is suspended from school, of course, all settings should be following this statutory guidance. They should be doing things like setting and marking schoolwork for suspended children. They should be, really importantly, providing a reintegration strategy and a meeting for that child and their parent, if they're or carer, once the child returns to school. It's really important to do that, to sort of reset expectations and say, look, what's happened has happened. You're back in school now. We really want you to succeed with us. That suspension is over. Let's work together and let's design a strategy to improve your behaviour and keep you in school and prevent the sort of often, alarmingly prevalent repeat suspensions that children are receiving. While a child is suspended, or while a child is placed in an alternative provision setting, there should be regular review meetings where professionals surrounding that child are thinking about how do we get the child back into school, or where should that child be. It also suggests a range of things that school settings should consider. So, for example, could a setting consider designating a pastoral professional who can check in with the child each day to see how they're doing and how they're getting on while they're suspended? Could a setting provide a mentor when a child returns to school to really provide that intensive additional support to a returning child to make sure that, again, we can really try and reduce the prevalence of those repeat suspensions? The thing that really alarms us currently at YF is these things aren't always happening. Again, I really don't want to put the blame on schools and teachers here. There are so many things on senior leaders' plates at the moment that sometimes these things can fall by the wayside. But if we're thinking about improving behaviour in the long term, reducing repeat suspensions, if we're thinking about how do we better protect children from involvement in violence, this is really critical. So we asked nearly 3,000 senior leaders in schools in England last February, so nearly a year ago. When you think about the last child that you suspended for between 2 and 5 days, which of these types of support did you give? Less than a third reported setting and marking schoolwork. Everyone should be doing that. Only 24% assigned a pastoral staff member to check in with the child daily. Only 2/3, 67%, reported holding a reintegration meeting with parents. That should happen in every case. Only 49% designed a reintegration strategy. Again, the statutory guidance is clear. That should happen in every case. Less than 1 in 10 provide a mentor. So that's only 7% actually, and only 9% offered any sort of academic catch-up support. We talk a lot about what children miss out on when they're absent from school. We need to talk a bit more about what children miss out on when they're suspended from school and how we can support them to reintegrate. That final stat there is also quite an alarming stat on when children are placed in alternative provision. Only 44% of head teachers visited the AP setting of the last child they placed in AP, and only half shared information about the child's needs and context. And we have lots of conversations with AP leaders who are not surprised by this as a statistic. Another thing that sort of increased the salience of this is, again, this now does feature in Ofsted's new inspection framework. So leaders and schools will now be inspected on this. Inspectors will consider the extent to which leaders reintegrate suspended pupils and those returning from off-site direction and alternative provision, and how they manage their return and their behaviour carefully. So we'd really encourage more of a focus on that. Really encourage a focus on how do we better support children to reintegrate back into school after suspension. But also, it's really important for us to acknowledge the racial disparities in suspension and exclusion rates. We know that children from certain ethnic minorities communities, such as Gypsy, Roma, and Irish traveller heritage communities, and children from Black Caribbean backgrounds and mixed Black Caribbean and white backgrounds are more likely to be suspended and permanently excluded. The evidence on how we can address that is quite limited and quite challenging. So we're delighted to include a case study in the guidance on how the Co-op Academy Leeds and Oasis Community Learning are delivering a really innovative programme, a parental engagement programme and social emotional learning programme to really address a lot of the points that I've already made, particularly in reference to Black Caribbean children and Gypsy and Roma traveller children. So they're delivering a parental engagement program where they look to get out and understand, right, what are the reasons for high levels of absence amongst children in these communities, and how can we support them to remain in school. And a social emotional learning program that comes with a volunteer mentoring initiative to really try and improve behaviour, and again, support these children to stay in school, to remain in school, and to reintegrate back into school after a suspension. So that's recommendation one, keep children in education. I mentioned at the outset, one of the reasons why it's so important to keep children in education is because schools provide trusted adults. Trusted adults are everywhere in school. And if you think, to your own educational experience, you will have had a relationship with a teacher, another member of staff in school that would have meant something to you, or at least I hope you did. And schools are full of those relationships. What's also clear from the evidence is that there are additional evidence-based interventions that schools can deliver that specifically provide trusted adults. And those are mentoring and the targeted provision of sports. So in terms of mentoring, we know that having a meaningful relationship with a trusted adult who understands the child and wants the best for them can protect them from involvement in violence. Now, keen not to oversimplify this, but just to make really clear what we mean by a mentor. A mentor is a child matched. In mentoring, a child is matched with a mentor and encouraged to meet them regularly. And mentoring has specific aims. So it aims to ensure that a child develops a good relationship with a positive role model. Often those children, and particularly vulnerable children, might not have that positive role model. Really critically, develop social skills and positive behaviours. 7 in 10 children who report perpetrating violence say they did so because they were provoked. Right, a lot of that is an inability to regulate emotion, to manage their social and emotional skills. And so, and mentoring can be a really crucial way in which you can, develop that emotional regulation. It's also really important to form constructive relationships with others. A lot of violence occurs between children out of peer conflict. And again, the experience of forming a constructive relationship with a positive role model can really support a child to develop those skills. This is such an alarming statistic, but there are 90,000 children in England and Wales, a Wembley Stadium full of vulnerable children who are either excluded, missing, have previously been arrested or severely absent, who do not have a trusted adult outside of their family. So again, I'd really encourage, school leaders or those working adjacent to schools to think about, right, who are those children? How do we get them the support of a trusted adult? How do we get them a mentor? Then when thinking about that, there are some implementation considerations to think about. So leaders should really think about how do they provide vulnerable children with mentoring over an extended period of time, so for at least 2 terms. That happens regularly, at least once a week. They should, of course, ensure that mentors receive appropriate training and supervision. They should seek to minimise the impact of any missed learning from lessons. Primarily, the best way to do this is deliver sessions after school. So children are most at risk of involvement in violence between 4 and 6 p.m. That's when violence peaks. That won't be a surprise to a lot of colleagues on the call. So think about, actually, that means you're not going to miss any lessons, and we can keep you free from risk at that time. Really carefully ensure that communication about the end of mentoring is clear. You want to ensure that children don't feel a real sense of loss and loss of support at the end. So make sure you communicate at the outset when mentoring is going to finish, and then signpost of support at the end. And again, really critically, ensure that staff in school are informed of the mentoring. It'd be really useful, for instance, if a form tutor knows that X child has a mentoring session at the end of the day, and can remind them and say, make sure you're on time for that. Hope that goes well. They can check in with them about it the next day. We also recognise that, yes, there are some local third sector organisations that can deliver this in schools. Schools often, lots of schools are already doing this, which is great. Schools are often using internal staff to do this, but it's not always that readily available. Another way in which schools can do this is via sports, and most schools are providing some sort of sports provision. Sports is great in that, and the evidence shows that sports can provide trusted relationships again. It can protect children at those vulnerable times, particularly if it's delivered after school, can build social and emotional skills, and it can act as a hook to get children involved in intervention like mentoring. So mentoring, we know, has an evidence base behind it. The evidence shows that mentoring reduces children's involvement in violence by 21%. How do we get children to do that mentoring? Well, let's align it with a sports program. So you play a bit of football, you play a bit of rugby, and then you do some mentoring at the same time. That can be really impactful. When delivering this, leaders should again ensure that it's done over a prolonged period of time, at least 2 terms, and done weekly. It's delivered after schools, again at that key risk time. You provide incentives to attend. This can include food or coaching accreditation courses, particularly for older children. Monitor attendance to those sessions to make sure that most vulnerable children are attending. Of course, consider arts, music activities. Not every child is interested in sport, and so whilst the evidence there isn't as strong, if you're combining that with mentoring, it can be a really impactful intervention. And reach out to local organisations to see what they have on offer. One example that we share in the guidance is a brilliant programme delivered by the Rugby Football League that we're funding and evaluating at the moment, called the Educate Mentoring Programme, which provides 12 weeks of mentoring to 11 to 14-year-olds who've been struggling with their behaviour. And because it's delivered by the local Rugby Football League club, the kids are really motivated to go. And they're also provided with a sports coaching accreditation, which again increases the motivation. So those are those 2 recommendations. Keep children education and provide them with trusted adults. I'll now hand over to Ben, who will talk a bit about the self-assessment that schools have given in relation to these.
Thank you so much, Joe. For colleagues on the call that attended the previous webinar, you might remember that we introduced you to our new self-assessment tool that we called EPIC. So this is a digital online self-assessment that was launched in July of 2025. It's a tool that allows you, as an education setting, to assess the violence prevention practice that's happening in your school or college setting. It takes 30 minutes with 37 questions filled in and provides you with a personalised insights report that we hope you will take away and prompt discussion with your senior leadership team, with your board of governors. And I want to just stress at the outset that all of the responses that you give remain anonymous to you and private to you, unless you'd like to share those results with us. What's interesting is that we've now had over 200 schools complete a self-assessment, and we've noticed that there is sometimes a gap in how schools feel they're doing in some of the areas that Joe's talked about versus what is actually happening on the ground. And I think that's particularly relevant to some of the issues that we've talked about today around attendance, suspensions, exclusions, and providing trusted adults. So we wanted to just spend a couple of minutes running a reflective exercise that will give you a snapshot of how to self-assess the violence prevention practice that's happening in your education setting, either for the school or college that you work in, or for colleagues who are on the call that might not necessarily work at school, a school that you're connected to. And I really encourage you to be as honest as you can. It's given the scale of the webinar today, we're not able to run it as an interactive exercise. So there's a real opportunity for you to be as honest as you can about what's really happening in your school setting. So for the questions that I'll ask the audience today, I'd like for you to rate yourself from never, rarely, sometimes, often, and always. So the first question to you is, do you plan appropriate interventions for pupils who have been suspended or are at risk of permanent exclusion? Is appropriate work set or alternative provision arranged for suspended children? When a child is suspended for between 2 and 5 days, do you assign a staff member to check in with them every day? And lastly, when children are suspended, do you design a reintegration strategy to support their return to school and college? And through the lens of providing a trusted adult, we'd similarly ask you, is mentoring provided to vulnerable children? And if it is provided to vulnerable children, are you providing it for at least 1 hour per week over a minimum of 2 full terms? Do the mentors receive appropriate training prior to commencing mentoring? And do they receive regular supervision? And lastly, are weekly coach-led sports sessions or outdoor activities attended by vulnerable children? And just to show you some of the responses that we have had to some of these questions already through the self-assessment, I've pulled out some of the responses for the latter questions there. And I think it's interesting that you will often talk to people who work in the education sector, as I do for my role. And there is sometimes the perception that, schools are providing trusted adults. And they certainly are. But through the lens of mentoring that we look at it at the YEF, we found that 25% of schools are reported sometimes, never, or rarely providing mentoring to vulnerable children. Similarly, when we've asked for those that are receiving it, are they receiving it for at least 1 hour a week for a minimum of 2 full terms, which is a key recommendation that we pull out in that section of the report. 53% have reported that they only sometimes, rarely, or never are able to offer it across that scale. And lastly, I think Joe just touched upon the weekly coach-led sports sessions being delivered. When we've asked schools across England, are you delivering this and are they attended by vulnerable children? Just under 40% have commented that sometimes, rarely, or never are they providing these sports sessions. So I think it just shows that perhaps in the context and through the lens of providing a trusted adult, there's many schools that perhaps lack that provision across the country today. But we have a very limited picture of the practice that's happening across the whole country. As I mentioned, we've only had 220 schools complete a self-assessment, and we're in a big mission across the next 6 months to drive those numbers up, which will allow us to really understand the violence prevention practice that's happening across the country. So as a takeaway task today, we'd love to invite you to have your school complete a self-assessment and contribute to that kind of national picture that we are building a violence prevention practice. I just want to stress again that if you do complete this as a school, your results do remain anonymous and private to you, unless you'd like to share them with us. So the link to the self-assessment will be shared in the Q&A function that you can find at the top of the Microsoft Teams bar. But the link is also included in the slides, and that will be emailed out to you. So we really hope to drive those numbers of schools completing the self-assessment, and in turn begin to report back to the education sector what's happening across the country. I'll pause there and pass you back to Dom for the opportunity to start the Q&A.
Fantastic. Ben, Joe, thank you so much for that. Really, really interesting. Always good to hear where the guidance that DfE have put out is working, is covering the right things, and that we need to work together on how we implement that, get it right, use evidence-based ways of how schools have had success with that process. Well, please do continue submitting questions through the Q&A function on Teams. It should be kind of at the top in your menu bar if people haven't used that function before. We've already had a few through, so thank you very much for those. I will sort of chair these to YEF colleagues. So the first one is to understand a bit more about how YEF's work supports schools to fulfill their statutory, to fulfill the statutory guidance role as a protective factor for pupils who are most vulnerable to exclusion and serious violence. So the work YEF does to help schools fulfill their statutory duties.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think in the webinar today you've got a slither of what that looks like, but it's only the start of it. So part of it is as we discussed today, recognising the protective role that schools play, and therefore how do we keep children in education and providing guidance to schools to do that. And how do we provide trusted adults? But what you'll see in the next webinars is we'll get into more detail on the wider evidence base that we've either commissioned research on and completed projects on, or synthesised the evidence on on other interventions that should be delivered. So we'll talk in the next session on how to develop social emotional skills and how to better deliver social emotional skills interventions, both at universal and a targeted level. We'll talk about relationship violence reduction, and violence against women and girls is a real core strategy of government at the moment. And there's lots of fantastic things that schools can be doing particularly in line with the new RSHE curriculum coming into place next year, which we're hugely excited about, on relationship violence reduction sessions in schools. Anti-bullying programs is another intervention that we'll talk about. So yeah, there's lots of interventions that we'll come on to talk about that fulfill the sort of wider suite beyond just trusted adults and presence in school.
Brilliant, thank you. On to the next one. So I think this is a really good one. What, out of everything you've shared today, would you advise a school to start with?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. The number one is to keep children in education. There's a reason why we had it first, and it's at the front of centre of our guidance. I think that the different perspective on this from a violence reduction perspective is to really think about those children that you're worried about. So really think about those vulnerable children, children who previously had a suspension, children who you may know have previously had contact with the police, children that just might struggle with peer relationships, right? Like who and schools are fantastic in knowing who these children are. You have a chat with any DSL at any point, and you can share a list of indicators, but the DSL will know who those children are. Really doubling your efforts and redoubling your efforts, and I know schools are already doing fantastic work on this to get those children into school, and when they are suspended, to reintegrate them back into school. We're really keen to emphasize to schools. I think often when we say to them, oh, schools play a key role in violence reduction, it's like, oh God, we've been asked to do something else here, and we've been asked to solve every problem in society. And the key thing that we're saying here is actually a lot of this isn't new stuff. Like, if you're just delivering really high quality work to get children into school, which you'll be looking to do anyway already for a whole host of reasons, that's very much where I'd start, but with a focus on ensuring that you're really focusing on those children who are particularly vulnerable.
Brilliant, thank you. And then the next one is from a leader who works in a trust of 10 schools, and they asked if their schools did the survey, would they be able to have results for the schools in their trust and then compare them to national data?
Yes, we're really happy to support groups, either within a multi-academy trust, a group of schools within a local authority. The only caveat is that each individual school just needs to share their results to tick to say they're happy to share their results. But we're really happy to support groups as much as possible. I'm going to put my email in response to that question in the chat. So if there are any other colleagues on the call who represent a group, a trust, a local authority, whoever it is, please feel free to email me, and we're happy to kind of figure out a package of support.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Ben. The next one is on the point you covered, Joe, on mentoring. And they asked, what mentoring training do you recommend for staff mentors, and whether there is online training?
That's a really fantastic question. So I'd recommend having a look at the guidance and recommendation too. So the things that to focus on are things like there's basics around safeguarding and making sure that they're following the standard safeguarding processes you'd be expecting them to follow at school. Role play training can work really well. Like, to what extent are role playing challenging conversations and difficult conversations are often a really useful aspect of mentoring programs that work quite well. Is goal setting. So at the start of the intervention, the mentor will sit down with a child and they'll set some goals over the next 2 terms for what they want to achieve in the mentoring sessions and beyond the mentoring sessions. I don't know. Let's say a child's on a report card. They'd like to reduce the amount of times that they're on a report, or whatever that goal, or they'd like to improve their attainment in a particular subject, or they'd like to attend a sports club more often, and then they can work on those goals together over a few months. There is lots of fantastic practice from third sector organisations who are delivering really good mentoring programs. And what I do is, if you're thinking about bringing them in, is to just compare them. So in recommendation 2 of our guidance, we set out some implementation considerations. What should good mentoring look like? if you're getting a provider in, or if you're looking to deliver training to mentors, does it match those things? Does it align with what we'd expect to see in good mentoring?
Excellent, thank you. And then a really pertinent one. So this one is asking whether the techniques and approaches that you've set out apply to children with additional needs, or whether there's anything that you would do differently for children depending on their needs.
Yes, certainly. So certainly, particularly with these two recommendations as well, we'd very much recommend that these apply to children with additional needs. We've had a real laser focus across the recommendations to make sure that they apply appropriately to all types of school, and a real focus on AP settings as well. And we know that children in AP settings are really at real elevated risk of later involvement in violence. So we've written the guidance to support a wide range of needs and children who are exhibiting different needs. And again, I'd reference that point on attendance and suspension exclusion. In that support that you're giving, that's a universal thing, right? Trying to get everyone back into school, but really making sure right, which children are particularly vulnerable. Are we giving them the support they need is really key.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we might have just lost Joe. So brilliant, thank you, Joe. That's really good to know that those apply to that these are useful techniques for students with a range of needs. Our last question, and then I will wrap up and remind everyone of the upcoming series of this webinar. Is just helping locate us in how this problem has evolved for teachers and leaders. How is this different from, say, 5 years ago? What's changed? What do people need to be thinking about now they might not have thought about a few years ago?
A fantastic question. So I think one of the things that is, obviously more prevalent and won't be surprising to school colleagues on the call is the online influence that children are now facing. We know that social media in particular can drive a lot of peer conflict. 20 years ago, if you had an argument with someone at school, you'd see them the next day and you'd deny what you said. You can't do that now because it's written down and someone can show you it. And we also know that conflict doesn't end at the school gates now. Children go home and it can continue. We're really heartened by what's in the new RSHE curriculum coming in next year, and so we'd really recommend schools have a look at that, have a look at the content in there, and think about how that's delivered, because a lot of that really directly addresses some of those challenges.
Brilliant, thank you, Joe. I think that's a really good place to wrap us up. So first of all, obviously, massive thank you to Joe and Ben for taking us through that presentation. Really interesting to learn about the trends and what works. Really good to hear about the EPIC tool, which we know schools that have used it have found that a really helpful assessment tool. Thanks, obviously, everyone who has joined today. Really good to have so many people here. And as I say, such a range of leaders from across schools and the wider sector. So 2 final points from me. First is please do register for the final 2 webinars in this series. Rachel and the team is going to post a link in the chat, but these sessions will cover, so third will cover social and emotional skills development, and then the fourth will cover violent times and places and unproven approaches. And then secondly, these webinars are here to be helpful to you. We really value your feedback. Your feedback makes them better. The feedback link is also going to be in the chat. So please do take a couple of minutes to complete it, help us understand what's worked, help us understand what will be useful to you. So all that's left to say is thank you for joining today. Thank you, obviously, for your commitment to keeping children safe in your schools across the country. We look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thanks very much.